So behind me is the Mount Clare station, built in 1851. This also marks the beginning of the first mile. So this is essentially mile marker 0. And at just out at 1.2 miles out, we'll come across the first stone. But why walk when you can ride? I'm sure you've heard that one before. Why don't we get on the Mile 1 Express? We'll take that out there. My bunions are killing me, so I'd rather ride. First class head-end view here. So this is leaving, we're heading west from platform 2 here, and that switch to the left takes you into the North Car Shop lead to those tracks there. So something to note here is to the right of us would have been the massive shop complex that was Mount Clare. So we are starting to get to the outer limits of it here, and here's the Ostend Street crossing. So to the left, if you see that concrete, well, I know here's yard limits too. Pretty trucking here. We're probably doing about 6-7 miles an hour, but that concrete abutment was actually the very first culvert for the railroad. Eventually it was filled in. And then it became the master carpenter's office until that was demolished. I'm not really sure. So to the right, which is out of camera view, would be the very west end of those shops, and that was where the blacksmithing shop was. A couple of the other smithing shops that they were the foundries and whatnot were along there as well. And we're getting ready to go across the Carey Street Bridge here. Something to note is the Carey Street Bridge is actually kind of cool in the fact that it's actually a fairly recent thing. Recent meaning 1924, so it's about 100 years old. We're crossing it now. And that was actually not originally, obviously it was not there before 1924, and Carey Street just dead-ended into this massive fill of earth in which the tracks went over. So it's kind of cool. Something also to note that I didn't talk about was when you leave platform 2 and you begin to head west, that is D Yard. And so the railroad named these as you were going along sequentially here. So this is actually C Yard that we're passing through right now. You see the horse stables to the right. There's the platform to get on there. To the left is the beginnings of the H.G. Davis, well, beginnings though, which you can see the H.G. Davis coal dock, which we did a video about, so make sure you check that out, some good info there. So yeah, so this area here was C Yard, and there were, if you look at the 1927 Johns Hopkins University aerial survey that they did, you can kind of surmise about anywhere from 6 to 8 tracks that came through here originally. So that is pretty epic. Tender Kitchen is to the right there. You see the concrete structure inside of there. We're going to do a video about that at some point in the future, so I'm not going to spoil that for you, but Tender Kitchen was actually originally built for freight cars, and it eventually began life as that, and then it eventually morphed into a place to rebuild steam locomotive tenders. So if we keep going here, this is we are on the North Main. So we're still heading west here, and the restoration shop here is in front of us. And this is kind of neat, I think, to point out that this route here we only use whenever the museum does the Day Out with Thomas event. It's the only time that we ever take the North Main, and that's simply because there's less curves and really tight switches, and so it makes it easier on the little Thomas dummy locomotive that we get from Strasbourg that does that. So that is the reason why we use the North Main at the museum for Thomas. And I think I'll shut up here and let the sounds of the 645 prime mover here do what they do. So we're kind of starting to leave the confines here of C Yard, and we're starting to move into the entrance of B Yard, or what would have been B Yard. Ahead of us there, that bridge, that's the Monroe, it's the South Monroe Street Bridge. From what, it's really hard to find a date for that, but I want to surmise just from photos. There's a really good photo of it. I believe this was just after it was built. Again, could be wrong on that, but it's 1914. And obviously, this bridge has been redone several times since then, but I'll flash that picture of the 1914 South Monroe Street Bridge there up on the screen. You can see how primitive it was. You can see the factories in the background there, and the light poles going around and all that stuff. So. Something else I want to note is, as it pertains to the building of the railroad, is this would have been fairly, for the most part, fairly flat territory. There really wasn't that much for them to either put fills in or do cuts in. I mean, very minimal. But it's not until you get out to the Carrollton Viaduct where they really started to have to do fills around it or before it. There is one, and I mentioned this in the Carrollton Viaduct video, which will come out later, is there is a culvert that is before you get to the Carrollton Viaduct, so east of it, and Railroad East, and that is the Gwynns, not the Gwynns Falls, but that, because the Carrollton Viaduct goes over that, but the Gwynns Run, so it's smaller, right? Runs are smaller than falls. There's the Gwynns Run culvert, because it's not really a viaduct, but it's really hard to get to, as I mentioned in that video, and that area is not exactly in the best part of Baltimore, so I would not recommend going out there and trying to find it. It still exists and it still does what it does in terms of, you know, providing a passage for water, but I would not go and seek it out. What we're passing through now is the museum's runaround track, so we typically take cars up here, passenger cars up here, or freight cars, and sort them out, you know, and then shove whatever it is back east to the platform or wherever it is that it's going. To the far left, that track on the far left is the forerunner track for CSX, and that was also there when the B&O. Not that original rail, because it's all continuously welded rail now from CSX, but it was there when B&O began to upgrade Mount Clare in the late 1880s, somewhere in that time frame. CSX uses it now as more for a storage track and sometimes a crew change point. And on a very rare occasion when the passenger train from the museum heads out here, we will see that. We'll see it sitting there, changing crews normally up by the Carrollton Viaduct. So now we're starting to get to the very tail end here of B Yard. To the right there, that switch that goes off, that's the Catherine Street switch, and that served multiple industries. I want to say that switch was probably put in the early 1900s, not 100% on that. To the right is also behind that fence, it's the Connex boxes, but behind all those is the scrapyard that's there. That's been there since at least the Hopkins University aerial survey in 1927 that I mentioned earlier. So it's definitely been scrapping stuff for quite a long time. Well, I can see the derail up there for us, so I think this just about stops it. And we'll go ahead and get on the ground and talk a little bit more about that first stone. Alright, so we've made our way the 1.2 miles west, and this is what you would come across and find. Yeah, it's an unsuspecting green box with a little bit of graffiti on it, but let's talk more about that. So before we get into what's behind mystery door number 1, or known as this green box, let's talk about, first and foremost, how did we get to this point? Well, the year is 1827, it's February, and as made possible by multiple donations from wealthy Marylanders and the state of Maryland, the city of Baltimore, and other people, a charter was formed in order to reach the Ohio River Valley by rail. Now, at the same time, there's also a competing form of transportation known as the C&O, Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, where their goal was to go from the Potomac Basin in D.C. out to the same area, the Ohio River Valley. And it was kind of a curious match to see who would get to, one, the Ohio River Valley first, but who would actually reach certain destinations. For instance, the B&O would be the first ones to reach Cumberland, Maryland in 1842. In 1850, 8 years later, the C&O Canal would inevitably reach there, and that would be the terminus. The B&O eventually won, if you will, its kind of battle, its war, not really a war, but more of a healthy competition, a healthy building out west, if you will, to help commerce at that time. So early 1800s, Baltimore was in a giant, we'll call it commerce battle, or commerce war, whatever you would term it, with Philadelphia, New York, Boston. And New York really took the stranglehold when the Erie Canal was built. Because now you can float your goods up and down, and you don't have to go by horseback and coaches, stagecoaches, etc., etc. Now you have a more dependable, at the time, transportation method. So, again, in those cities, commerce was the big thing, and getting out to the Ohio River Valley for both D.C. and Baltimore was the name of the game. And so, again, February 1827, the charter was done. It was written in ink. And as soon as the ink dried, these wealthy men sat around and said, all right, it's time to build a double track, they called it a double railroad, but a double track main line out to the Ohio River Valley. So about a little over a year and a half later, on July 4th, 1828, a ceremony was held in the city of Baltimore, right here. Well, it ended here. It began further down, close to the Inner Harbor, and it made its way here. But there were huge dignitaries there, and the most profound one is Charles Carroll of Carrollton. He was not only a prolific American at that time,
but his claim to fame was he was the last living signer of the Declaration of Independence. I find that absolutely neat and fascinating that they saw him as this figure that could come in and turn the first spade of dirt to put the stone in the ground. And it was just, people were tickled pink, but they were also scared. So let's go back to the ceremony. So it's July 4th, 1828. It's a cool, brisk July morning. Luckily, the heat wave that they were having in Baltimore that was up in the high 90s had broken. So it's a cool, brisk morning. And fanfare was about. People had taken the sashes out of their windows. They wanted to see what was going on. How were these crazy Baltimoreans going to build a railroad? Well, this parade and fanfare came to here. Behind me, it's a scrapyard now, but there would have been a huge booth, a huge pavilion where dignitaries sat and looked over the ceremony. And the Masons, the Masonic chapter came in, and they leveled the stone. And Charles Carroll of Carrollton uttered his famous words.
I consider this among the most important acts of my life, second only to my signing of the Declaration of Independence, if it even be second to that.
The prolific words that were spoken. Charles Carroll put his shovel into the ground, turned the first spade. The Masons came in, they leveled it out, and they said, this is a very true and very form-fitting stone. This is good. We like this. And that was it. That was the beginnings, the humble beginnings. Well, not really humble. That was the fanfare that was the beginnings of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And what would follow would be a march out west. And what we're going to do is, in this channel, in this little series, we're going to do a series here where we're going to follow James Dilt's book, The Great Road. We're going to use that as a guide. And that's going to take us all the way out to Rosebee's Rock and the Ohio River Valley. And that is what's going to get us through each little section of this. And we are going to learn some stuff. So, fast forward here. The year is now 1890s. The stone was all but forgotten. And in August of 1898, some track workers were out here, about a mile and a half out, or a mile and a quarter or so, out of the Mount Clare shops, and they were doing some track work, and they noticed, they were digging, they found a stone, this giant stone. They had unearthed, which had been buried for a while, the B&O's first stone. So, that was the beginning of the B&O's really big push to begin to catalog their history. And in this case, this first stone and the ceremony itself was cataloged in multiple ways. The stone was also put on display at the 1927 Fair of the Iron Horse. Later, 1933, 1934, they did an entire retelling and an entire show of the Masons and Charles Carroll. Somebody obviously stood in for him because he was dead as a doornail. But they had recreated the laying of the first stone. And to follow that, when they opened, or when they started the B&O, at that time, B&O Transportation Museum in 1953, there was another ceremony where they recreated the laying of the first stone. That's how prolific it was. So with that said, why don't we open this up and have a look-see. All right, well, if this doesn't start the party, well, I don't know what does. So this is actually a recreation, or a re-etching, if you will, of the stone. And I'll read this to you. Site of the first stone, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, erected July 4th, 1828, marking the first mile Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, given by CSX Transportation to the B&O Railroad Museum of March 18th, 1992. So that's pretty epic. Let me add some commentary here, which is I've been at the museum for a little over 8.5 years now, and I talked to the the superintendent of rail ops, Dwayne, who's been here since the dawn of time. It seems like I think he may have met Jesus. I don't know, But Dwayne has told me that in the past, whenever they did the train rides and they would bring people out here, the 1.25 miles out west, they would actually stop and let people down, or they would allow them to view from the coaches, and they would come out here and they would open this up. And they'd say, they would read it to the people and say, you've now traveled the first mile of commercially laid track in all of America. How epic is that? So, not sure what year it was. It's sometime, because the history is a little skewed on this, but sometime in the 20th century, the original stone was, again, removed from here. And at some point, it ended up in the museum, where now you can see it when you go from, as soon as you walk in through the gift store, of course, to the left is the first stone. Make sure you stop and you look at that, because not only is that the beginnings, the very, very epic beginnings of the B&O, but there's also a great little statue of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, and they have some of the original implements, the trowel, and I believe one of the squares that they used to level the stone. Take a look-see the next time you're there, and you can now visualize for yourself, and especially if you take the train ride like we did, the first mile of commercially laid track in all of America. So there's one thing I want to point out before I forget this, is I believe this stone, once they unearthed it in 1898, it was on display out here. And I want to say that because if you look down here, you can see there is a poured concrete footer right here that would be roughly the size of, the outline size of the little pedestal, not little, the mighty pedestal that the first stone sat on. And also, I'm sure you can see this, there's numerous of these bars, square bar stock, that apparently, I think it must have come up, wrapped over, and created like a cage around the first stone after they unearthed it. I feel fairly certain about that. Again, I cannot prove that 100%, but if somebody else knows better, definitely insert that in the comments section. This to me seems like this is the most likely reason for why this little footer and the cut-off bars square stock exists. And thus begins our epic journey ourselves out to the Ohio River Valley. And again, we'll be using James Dilt's book as a guide, use that as a reference as we go through. And I highly encourage you to pick that up if this is of any interest to you. It's a heavy read, I'm not gonna lie to you, it's a pretty heavy read, but boy oh boy, it is pretty good stuff, and it's very, very well written. So hopefully you got something out of this, and now you know a little bit more, if you've taken the train ride out here, what's behind this green box. So stay tuned for the next installment of this video with the Carrollton Viaduct. I think you'll really like that one. So signing off, this is Trevor from History on the Move. Go out and make your own history. Read history. Really discover this stuff. It's pretty epic. See you again next time.